Alright, so today I want to introduce you to a brand new Ball Python gene coming out of Germany called the Orbit Ball Python. And the Orbit gene makes some pretty amazing combinations when mixed with other genes, and it's a codominant gene with a pretty amazing super form. And I have to admit there's quite a few new genes in ball pythons and some lesser known genes, and usually I don't do a video on those genes until I find a gene that has a lot of potential when working it into other combinations. And let me tell you, the Orbit is pretty amazing as far as what I'm seeing. And as a matter of fact, if you actually go over on the European site of Morphmarket, they have about 20 Orbit and Orbit combinations listed over there, showing kind of the potential of what you can do with this gene. And if you actually come over here on the US version of Morphmarket or the South African version of Morphmarket, you won't see any Orbits. So hopefully we'll actually get some Orbits over here in the United States and work it into a lot of combinations. And some of these new genes are a little bit tricky because sometimes everyone's trying to figure out, all right, what does it actually do when you work it into other combinations? And I've seen pretty much enough to where I can kind of get a handle on the potential of this gene and exactly what it's doing, mixing it with other genes. So today I want to jump over the internet and I want to show you the potential of the brand new Orbit gene. Alright, so I'm going to jump over here on morphmarket.com and I want to start with this snake right here. This is an Orbit, just a single gene Orbit. And I'd say just as a standalone morph, it looks pretty subtle, but it works really well with a lot of combinations to really make some impressive results, even though it's a really subtle morph just by itself. As a matter of fact, if you actually look at this, it almost looks like a normal ball python with kind of a jumbled up pattern, which is kind of crazy. And kind of the weird thing about the Orbits is you'll actually notice on a lot of the combinations you'll have some really strong striping along the top, and sometimes you get some almost like these dog bone patterns on the stripe up on the top, and sometimes you'll actually get some, it's almost like this wavy line up on top of the pattern. And a lot of times with your Orbit combinations you'll actually get a really crazy jumbled up pattern, a reduced pattern on the side of the ball python. Even though you can almost see some alien heads like this is kind of deceiving because it makes some pretty amazing combinations when you work it in with other genes. And the other thing I kind of noticed about the Orbit is that to me it seems like it's a dark gene where it darkens the background of the snake just a little bit. I'd say it's one of the, I haven't really read much about it if people are considering it to be a dark gene, but it seems like in a lot of combinations it does darken the background, especially right on the top, along the top ridge of the snake, which is kind of interesting. So I actually wanted to show you this one over here. So take a look at this. This is another version of the Orbit. So it can actually be pretty variable from one Orbit to the other. And it's kind of interesting with this one, you see it's a little bit more yellow. That's why I like to look at a couple versions of just the standalone gene, and it seems like maybe it's kind of the yellow color maybe is coming from the version of the normal that it started with. So sometimes some of your normals can be kind of a normal looking color. Sometimes the normals can be pretty yellow, and I don't think it really brings in a whole lot of yellow color in some of your combinations. Although I have seen, it seems like a lot of combinations working Orbit into it, you get kind of a coppery color, kind of almost like an orange coppery color coming in with a lot of your combinations, which is kind of interesting. And look at the pattern right on the top, this kind of like a dog bone pattern. Sometimes you get the really strong striping with the Orbit and Orbit combinations. So take a look at this. This is the super form, and I always like to look at the super form because you can kind of see everything amplified with two copies of the gene. And you can definitely tell on this one, it looks like to me like it's really darkening the background. This is probably a lot darker than even your darkest normals as far as darkening the background. And you can actually see on this one, it kind of brings out more of that goldish, almost like a yellow gold kind of a sheen to it as far as kind of turning all the pattern kind of a gold color, and it's really even jumbling up the patterns even more on the side. It almost looks like something you'd see like in maybe a hurricane or a trick or something like that as far as jumbling up the pattern. But let me tell you, when you mix it with other genes, it definitely reacts completely different than those genes. So one of the genes that, as a matter of fact, if you're actually starting with a brand new gene, what I would do, probably the first two things that I would breed it to is a blue-eyed leucistic and a black black-eyed leucistic. So you can see, number one, if it's in the blue-eyed leucistic complex. So this is actually a Mojave, and the Mojave is actually a really good choice to figure out what this gene does as far as if it's in the blue-eyed leucistic complex, because certain genes mix with the Mojave. So for example, if you actually took the lesser and you bred it to a Mojave, you would get a blue-eyed leucistic that is really bright white with bright blue eyes. And then if you actually had some other genes, say for example you use like the Mystic or the Phantom with the Mojave, you'd get a purplish colored snake with kind of a faded out pattern. You get the Mystic Potion or the Purple Passions. So the Mojave is a really good choice to breed a brand new gene to, so you can figure out if it's in the blue-eyed leucistic and how it reacts if you get a really strong bright white snake or if you get kind of a purple colored snake. And here's what happens if you mix the Orbit with the Mojave. Take a look at this. This is definitely not in the blue-eyed leucistic complex, and look at what it does to the Mojave. Completely reduces the pattern, which is kind of wild, and it really brings in a lot of striping right along the top of the snake. And as a matter of fact, you actually get some of this, almost like this bubbling kind of a line right down the top that you see in certain combinations. And kind of the interesting thing that I've seen with a lot of your Orbit combinations, it seems like it really brings in a lot of black right up on the top of the snake, and then on the bottom, a lot of times, it seems like you get almost like a calico effect with a little bit of white coming up the sides of the snake. I can't figure out if it's just the combination of the Orbit and the Mojave bringing up the white, or if it's the Orbit itself. Sometimes it's kind of hard with these new genes, unless you actually breed it in a bunch of combinations and really get a handle on the gene. It's kind of difficult. So I actually brought up a couple more examples of the Orbit Mojave so you can see how variable it is. So take a look at this one. This is the same exact combination, the Orbit and the Mojave. And in this one you can actually see it's bringing in a lot more white, almost like the calico type pattern coming up on the side. And look at what it does to the pattern on the side. You know, the Mojave usually has kind of the keyhole patterns on the side of the snake, and this completely shatters it into these little kind of scrambled up patterns. And on this one, you can actually see quite a bit of line right down the top in a jumbled up pattern all the way down the top. I actually pulled up one more over here, and this one's kind of interesting too, because on this particular combination with the Mojave and the Orbit, you can actually see kind of that almost like a coppery, almost like a bronze colored coming through. And the first thing that I thought of when I actually saw this snake, the first thing that I thought of is that this looks almost exactly like the combination of the Mojave and the Mahogany. The Mahogany is a dark gene, and it actually brings in a lot of this coppery color in a lot of your combinations. And that's one of the other things you have to really be careful of when you're actually thinking you have a new gene. You start breeding it into these combinations. A lot of times you could potentially have another version of a gene, or maybe you have a gene you're not familiar with. And I think that may be what happened with the acid, the static, and the confusion. Multiple people had different kind of versions of the same gene. They all named it something different. And I think, you know, a lot of times you actually get multiple names for a certain gene, because a lot of times a lot of people kind of discover it all at once and they're not familiar with some of the new stuff coming out, and then they'll find something like this and then they'll go, oh, it's a new gene, when in fact it's actually just another gene that's something that's already discovered yet. So that's one of the things you kind of have to watch out for. So this is actually the Mojave Orbit, and to kind of compare that to the Mahogany, I actually pulled up the Mahogany over here, and take a look at this. This is really close, where you have kind of this striping right along the top and a reduced pattern on the sides. I've actually seen some Mahogany Mojaves that are really close to the Orbit Mojave. So sometimes you have to be careful if you actually have the same gene, but let me tell you, they're completely different genes. And one way you know for sure that this is an Orbit versus a Mahogany is you can actually look at the super form. So take a look at this. This is actually a super Mahogany, which is a completely patternless, really super dark snake. So the Orbit is definitely not a Mahogany. As a matter of fact, if you actually compare the super super mahogany with the super orbit over here. You can definitely tell they're completely different genes. And I don't think I've ever seen anything that is on the market that's really acting like the super orbit in some of these combinations. So take a look at this one. This is kind of interesting. This is the super orbit with the addition of the Mojave, and look at what it's really doing. It's really bringing up a lot of the white on the sides and really reducing the pattern. And in this case, with the super orbit, you get a really strong line. Almost looks like the strong line that you'd see in the Mahogany Mojave combination, which is kind of interesting. Sometimes it's kind of close, but if you actually take, as a matter of fact, actually just for kicks, I pulled up the Mojave Super Mahogany so you can get an idea of the difference between the two genes. Let me tell you, this is definitely not a super mahogany, even though in some combinations it looks really similar to the mahogany when you're working it in, which is kind of interesting. So here is the second thing you can actually mix with a brand new gene. I would suggest mixing a new gene with something in the blue-eyed leucistic and then mixing it with something in the black-eyed leucistic like the fire. So the fire is pretty interesting because you can actually have a black-eyed leucistic. Say for example, if you actually took fire and you mixed it with sulfur, you'd end up with a completely white snake with black eyes, which is a black-eyed leucistic. And the other thing is, there's also other genes that are allelic with fire. You can actually use vanilla or disco to make the vanilla creams or the disco infernos that are allelic combinations, and it really jumbles up the pattern. It's pretty obvious when you make something with fire that's allelic because you get this really crazy jumbled up pattern. So it's one of the good ones to actually take a new gene and breed it into to see what the effects are working it into fire. So here's what happens if you take fire and you work in orbit. Take a look at this. You can definitely tell that this gene is not in the black-eyed leucistic complex. Essentially what you're getting is you're getting a snake that pretty much looks like an orbit as far as the pattern on the snake. You can definitely see, and as a matter of fact, to me it looks like it's really darkening the background much more than you'd see just in a fire combination. So I'm convinced that the orbit does darken the background in some of these combinations. And then you can kind of see the scrambled up like a dog bone pattern that is pretty typical of some of your orbit combinations, and you'll see some scrambled up pattern on the sides. It kind of really scrambles up the kind of the Roswell gray alien heads that you'd work in here. But to me, it looks like the orbit has a lot of potential working it into other genes. I'm really looking forward to seeing what the orbit can do mixed in with some of the other Ball Python genes. Now let me tell you, there's like, almost 200 Ball Python genes, so there's a lot of work to do working orbit into a lot of other combinations. All right, so it is time for the question of the day. And Mr. Danny Lane asks, is it possible to make a double allelic complex, such as a freeway cream? And that is a very good question. As a matter of fact, you actually can make a freeway cream that has 4 genes, the freeway and the vanilla cream combined in a single snake. And let me tell you, if you're actually doing this project, you're kind of going down a rabbit hole. As a matter of fact, I actually went over to Morphmarket.com and I didn't see any freeway creams over there, but I did see one highway cream. And the problem is, if you're trying to make the highway cream, essentially this is what you have to do, is you actually have to take a highway and cross it with a vanilla cream. So the highway is the combination of the yellow belly and the gravel. And the problem is if you actually take a highway and you breed it to something else, half the offspring come out as gravel, half come out as yellow belly, and you can't tell the difference between the gravel and the yellow belly. And it's exactly the same with the vanilla cream. So if you took a vanilla cream, which is the vanilla and the fire, and you bred it to something else, half the offspring come out as vanilla, half come out as fire. So if you actually took a vanilla cream and you bred it to a highway, essentially what you'd end up with is you'd end up with a snake with 2 genes, but you wouldn't know which of the 4 genes that it actually contained. So it would either contain the gravel or the yellow belly, and it would also contain the vanilla or the fire. So you have 2 genes in there and you're not even sure of one of the genes, which gets a little bit complicated. So if you're trying trying to actually prove it out. That's pretty much the only way you can do it, is you'd have to kind of blindly breed them together, and then you'd have to prove out every single snake to breed it to something else and look at the offspring to figure out what are the genes in the snakes, so you can actually just figure out what the genes are in there in the first place. But once you figured it out, you could probably produce quite a bit of the double allelic complex, but it'd be pretty difficult. So that is pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.
Thank you.